You have been operating for a long time on the assumption that the things that matter most, peace, acceptance, genuine belonging, must be earned, that they are available on the other side of enough effort, enough improvement, enough demonstrated worthiness. And somewhere in the middle of a life that has involved genuine effort, you have begun to wonder whether the earning is working, whether the peace that was supposed to arrive after enough has been done is actually arriving, whether the worthiness you have been building is producing the thing that worthiness was supposed to produce. Shinran, a 13th century Japanese Buddhist monk who founded the most widely practiced form of Buddhism in Japan today, had a diagnosis for this that is either the most liberating thing you will encounter in philosophy or the most uncomfortable, possibly both. He said, "The grace you are seeking does not arrive because you have become good enough. It arrives precisely because you have not. The condition for receiving it is not merit. It is the honest recognition of your own inadequacy. The full, clear-eyed, completely undefended acknowledgment that you cannot, through your own effort alone, produce what you most need." This is not an invitation to stop trying. It is an invitation to stop pretending that the trying is what earns the thing. There is a specific exhaustion that accumulates in the person who has been performing adequacy for a long time. Not the exhaustion of genuine effort, that has its own satisfaction. The exhaustion of the performance, the maintenance of the version of yourself that is competent, together, further along the path than the private reality confirms. The gap between the self that is presented and the self that is experienced, the mess underneath the managed surface, the doubt underneath the certainty, the need underneath the self-sufficiency, and the enormous, largely invisible effort required to keep the gap from showing. Most spiritual and philosophical frameworks address this by offering better tools for the improvement project. Become more disciplined, more aware, more compassionate. Close the gap through sustained effort. The assumption underneath is that the gap is temporary, a condition to be corrected on the way to the worthy self that the practice is producing. Shinran was born in 1173 near Kyoto into a family of the lower aristocracy. His parents died when he was young, his father when he was 4, his mother when he was 8. At 9 years old, he entered the monastery on Mount Hiei, the great center of Tendai Buddhism that Dogen also entered, roughly a generation later. He stayed for 20 years. He practiced with a seriousness and sincerity that the accounts consistently emphasize, not the practice of the person going through the motions, but of someone genuinely committed to achieving through effort what the tradition promised was achievable: purification of mind, the liberation that sustained practice was supposed to produce.
At 29, after 2 decades of rigorous monastic training, he descended the mountain. Not because the practice had failed in some obvious way, because something in him recognized that it had reached a limit, that after 20 years of genuine effort, the fundamental condition he had been trying to transform had not been transformed. The defilements the tradition identified, greed, anger, delusion, were still present. The pure mind that the practice was supposed to produce was not present. He was, after 20 years, still himself. He went to Kyoto and spent 100 days in retreat at the Rokakudo Temple, praying for guidance. On the 95th day, he received a vision of the Bodhisattva Kannon, who directed him to the teacher Honen. Honen was the founder of Pure Land Buddhism in Japan, and his teaching was already revolutionary. He said, "In this degenerate age, no one is capable of achieving liberation through their own effort. The path of self-power, Jiriki, the rigorous practice tradition of Tendai and Zen, is not available to beings of our kind. The only path is the Nembutsu, the recitation of the name of Amitabha Buddha, which draws the practitioner into the embrace of Amitabha's vow to save all beings regardless of their merit." Shinran absorbed this teaching and took it further than Honen himself had taken it. He argued not merely that other power was the practical path for those who could not manage the path of self-power. He argued that the very belief in self-power, the conviction that your own effort could produce liberation, was itself the deepest form of spiritual pride, the deepest obstruction, the thing that most completely prevented the receiving of the grace that was always being extended. He was exiled with Honen in 1207 when the authorities banned the Pure Land teaching. He spent 5 years in a remote province, married a woman named Eshini, a deliberately provocative act for a Buddhist monk, and spent the rest of his life teaching not in monasteries, but among farmers, outcasts, and ordinary people who had no access to the formal practice traditions and no pretense of spiritual accomplishment to maintain. His honesty about himself was radical and consistent. He described himself not as a teacher who had achieved something, but as a foolish being of wayward passions, a Bombu, someone who had looked clearly at the full reality of his own inadequacy and found, in that looking, not despair, but the specific relief of a person who has finally stopped performing. He died in 1963 at 90 years old, having founded what would become Jodo Shinshu, True Pure Land Buddhism, the largest Buddhist denomination in Japan today, with 12 million members. The philosophy, slowly because it requires care. Shinran's central insight is that the ordinary understanding of the spiritual life, practice produces merit, merit produces liberation, is organized around a fundamental misunderstanding of what liberation is and where it comes from. The person who believes they can earn their way to genuine peace, genuine freedom, genuine okayness with their own existence has not yet understood the depth of the problem they are trying to solve. The problem is not insufficient practice, it is Bombu, the inescapable, irreducible condition of being a person. The passions that the practice is designed to eliminate have roots that reach deeper than any practice can excavate. The anger, the greed, the delusion, these are not malfunctions to be corrected. They are features of the human condition that no amount of human effort can fully transcend. This is not pessimism, it is precision. And Shinran's precision leads somewhere surprising.
If the problem is deeper than practice can reach, then the solution must come from somewhere outside the practice, not from your merit, your effort, your accumulated spiritual achievements, from something that is extended toward you not because you have qualified for it, but because the condition for its reception is simply the honest recognition that you need it. Amitabha's vow, in the Pure Land Buddhist understanding, is the promise to save all beings without exception, not beings who have achieved sufficient purity, all beings, the Bombu included, especially the Bombu, because the person who has honestly recognized their own inadequacy has, in that recognition, let go of the pretense that was the primary obstacle. The grace was always being extended, the pretense was blocking the reception. This is what Shinran means by Shinjin, the entrusting heart, not faith in the theological sense of intellectual belief in propositions, the specific, bodily, completely honest act of releasing the self-sufficiency project and allowing the grace that was always present to be actually received. Not because you have become worthy, because you have acknowledged that the worthiness project was itself the problem. The relief that follows is not the satisfaction of achievement, it is the relief of the person who has finally stopped holding something that was too heavy to hold, and discovered that what was underneath it, what had been there the whole time waiting to be received, was more than sufficient. Now the bridge. Because Shinran was a 13th century Japanese Buddhist monk working within the specific doctrinal framework of Pure Land Buddhism, and most people watching this video are not. But here is what translates without the theology. The Self-Sufficiency Project. The conviction so deep it operates below the level of examination for most people, that the peace you are looking for must be earned, that genuine acceptance, genuine okayness, genuine belonging must be produced by your own effort before it is available, that if you stopped trying to become worthy, something worse than your current inadequacy would be revealed. Shinran is pointing at the specific cost of this conviction, Not that the effort is wrong, that the effort organized around earning rather than receiving is effort pointed in the wrong direction. That the thing you are trying to build, through the practice, the improvement, the performed adequacy, is something that cannot be built, it can only be received. And it is received precisely when the building project is honest enough to acknowledge its own limits. You do not need to accept the metaphysics of Amitabha to feel the force of this. The person who has honestly acknowledged their inadequacy, not performed humility, genuine recognition, and has discovered that the acknowledgment itself produces a quality of relief and acceptance that the achievement project never did, has experienced what Shinran is pointing at. The grace that arrives not at the end of the earning, but in the ending of the pretense that earning is what is required. Here is what Shinran asks of you, practically, today.
First, take the inventory of what you are performing rather than being, not as self-criticism, as honest accounting. Where is the gap between the self you present to your workplace, your relationships, your spiritual community, yourself, and the self you actually experience? Not to feel shame about the gap, to see it clearly. Because the gap is where the performance lives, and the performance is what Shinran identifies as the primary obstacle to receiving what you most need. Write down one thing you have been performing that the honest version of you would not perform. Not to confess it publicly, to know it privately. Because the known gap is the beginning of the honesty that Shinran calls the condition of grace. Second, practice the acknowledgement rather than the correction. When the inadequacy appears today, the anger that arrived when you intended patience, the fear that appeared when you intended confidence, the smallness you felt when you intended largeness, instead of immediately reaching for the correction, try the acknowledgement first. I am angry. I am afraid. I am, in this moment, the Bombu that Shinran describes, the being of wayward passions who cannot, through effort alone, be otherwise. Hold this acknowledgement without the immediate move to fix it. Not indefinitely, the correction has its place. Long enough to be honest about what is actually present before the management begins. This is not weakness. It is the specific, counterintuitive courage of the person who stops pretending long enough to be met where they actually are. Third, notice where the relief is already available. Shinran's Shinjin is not a dramatic conversion experience. It is, in his own description, the quiet settling of a person who has released a burden they were not designed to carry. The relief is available in ordinary moments, when the performance pauses, when the pretense drops, when you are briefly, accidentally, completely yourself. Notice those moments today, the conversation in which you said something true without calculating its effect, the moment when the inadequacy was visible and the world did not end. The specific quality of ease that accompanies the brief, unmanaged appearance of your actual self. That is the taste of Shinjin, not the culmination of a spiritual achievement, but the simple, available relief of the honest person who has stopped performing long enough to be received as they are.
Fourth, let the receiving be the practice. This is Shinran's most radical instruction, and the one most foreign to the achievement culture. Instead of asking what more you need to do, ask what you need to receive. Not passively. Shinjin is not passivity, and Shinran lived one of the most actively engaged lives in the history of Japanese Buddhism, but from a different center of gravity, not the center of the person who is earning their way forward, the center of the person who has recognized that what they most need is already being extended, and whose practice is, primarily, the practice of being open enough to receive it. Let that be the practice today. Not adding, receiving. The specific, available, completely unglamorous practice of a person who has stopped performing adequacy long enough to discover that what was waiting on the other side of the performance was not what they feared, it was what they needed. I want to close with the image of Shinran that stays with me. Not the vision at the Rokakudo, not the exile, not the marriage that scandalized the monastic establishment. The self-description. The man who spent 20 years on Mount Hiei, who practiced as sincerely as anyone in the tradition, who descended after 2 decades and described himself not as a teacher who had achieved something, but as a foolish being of wayward passions, who looked at what the practice had produced and told the truth about it, who took the honesty that most people reserve for their private journals and made it the foundation of a teaching that 12 million people still follow 800 years later. He did not make the inadequacy go away. He made it the door. The specific, available, requires no special qualification door through which the grace that was always being extended could finally enter. You are like Shinran, a being of wayward passions, not as a final verdict, as the honest starting point. And the starting point he spent 90 years insisting is already enough, not because the inadequacy is fine, because what responds to the inadequacy, what has always been responding to it, waiting for the acknowledgement that would allow the response to be received, does not require you to be otherwise than you are. The grace arrives precisely because you are not good enough, because you never were, and because the thing that was always being extended toward you was never conditioned on becoming otherwise. Here is the question Shinran leaves us with today. What are you performing that you are exhausted by performing? What version of yourself, more adequate, more together, more spiritually advanced than the actual experience confirms, are you maintaining at the cost of the honest recognition that might allow something real to arrive? And what would it feel like to stop, just for a moment, just here, to let the inadequacy be visible without the correction, and discover whether what Shinran spent 90 years pointing at was waiting on the other side of the pretense? Leave that in the comments, because naming what you have been performing is the beginning of the honesty that he said was the condition of everything else. Not the achievement, the acknowledgement. The door that was always there, available precisely because you are exactly who you are. I'll see you in the next one.